Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
In the room with us are Register reporters and editors. Some of them may be drifting in here after we started, but Bill Petrosky, who is one of our legislative reporters, is here. Why don't you go ahead and start by telling us about your background and especially what qualifies you in your mind to be a member of Congress.
Sure. Well, I've been in and around Iowa politics and government for the last 20 years. As one of my old bosses in that time used to say, Tom Vilsack used to say, I wasn't born here, but I got here as quick as I could. 1996, started with working for Leonard Boswell when he got elected to the Congress. Did work for Tom Vilsack during his governor's campaign. Many things after that, including the political director for Governor Culver. The most recent incarnation of that was I had the great honor and privilege to be the state campaign coordinator for Bernie Sanders, and then work on that incredibly joyful and purposeful campaign over the course of the whole year, the whole 16 months of that campaign in 6 other states. That brought me to where we all wound up in November of 2018. And my dear friend at that time, he's still my dear friend, but my dear friend Troy Price at that time was the political director for Hillary Clinton, asked me to go up to Waterloo, Iowa to run the GOTV in that area, where they thought it was a tough role, but also working hard to still win. Very proud that working up in that area, we were one of the 6 counties that Hillary Clinton was able to win in Iowa. So after that 2018, like so many other people, I started thinking about what was laying out in front of us. My career, my business has been in organizing and in politics, but not much different than a lot of other folks. Saw the country going in a direction that I didn't like, I didn't feel we should be going into. And so I figured I could take some of that experience I've had, not only on campaigns, but working within government and around government in the organizing, and perhaps be able to talk about the issues that mattered in a way that would make not only my party stronger, but in making my party stronger, be able to affect some of the change that I think needs to be affected, which is even more telling as we've seen what's happened, I believe, in the last 2 years of this administration.
What are the issues that you think matter most? I mean, everybody has a long list of priorities, sure, right? But what's the one that gets you out of bed and makes you really want to run for Congress?
I think the one that matters the most, because I think it's the question of our generation. And it's the question that we have to answer, just like political generations of the past have had to answer key questions. And that is Medicare for all. I believe in Medicare for all. I believe we have a health care crisis in this country because we're not addressing the issue the way it should be addressed. I think it's a failed system. I think it's a failed system to say that profit should be any part of a health care system. We're the richest country in the history of the world. We've done so much, not just for our own people, but for people all around the world. And so many other countries have taken this path, Cathy, and I just think we can do it. The simple fact of the matter is we've made this decision on other issues, on other things in this country in the past. Some things are so important and so part of the society we're trying to build that profit should have nothing to do with how we provide it to our citizens. I believe that's the question for this political generation. I think Medicare for All answers that question, that healthcare should not be profit motive, have a profit motive in any way, that every person deserves as their birthright the dignity of the healthcare that they need when they need it at the point that they need it.
If you're going to take profit motive out of healthcare, I mean, Medicare really just covers who's paying for the healthcare, right?
Correct.
I mean, so there's still plenty of profit in the healthcare system, prescription drugs, medical devices,
right,
et cetera. The for-profit hospitals, clinics. So how do you control
great question.
the costs?
Well, there's 2 things to that, and you're right. I should be clear on that. What I'm saying is just take the profit out of the healthcare. Who's paying the provider? Take the profit out of that. There should be no profit motive there. But once you do that within the Medicare system, you also put the government in a better position to negotiate prescription drug prices. You put them in a better position to lower some of those other prices for people. But the most important thing there, when I say profit is taken out of it, the profit motive, whether it's for a hospital or for those prescription drug providers, is doesn't affect the consumer any longer, because the single payer part of the Medicare for All is what will guarantee that everyone is able to access the health care that they need. And look, I know this sounds really radical to a lot of folks. This is not a radical idea. We've done it. Medicare for All is the single greatest social program in the history of the world. This country took had the will and I'll use the term guts to do that in the 1960s. Because really what we were saying was, we are not going to allow our senior citizens not to live in dignity because they couldn't afford the health care needs that they have as senior citizens. We did that as a society. We're just saying, let's take the most, and those that agree with me that Medicare for All is the answer and that it shouldn't be about profit, all we're saying is, let's take this most successful program in the history of the world and let's expand it and provide that same dignity to all of our citizens, so that no matter who you are, you walk out of that door every day to go to work, you don't have to worry about if something happens to you at work, if something that isn't foreseen, whether it's an injury, whether it's an illness, that you're going to lose everything that you built for your family because you happen to have a happenstance that you couldn't control. I think it's the best of us. I think Medicare for All showed when government does work in the proper way for the proper things, the positive that we can have on people. And so I'm going to go back and say, I don't think it's that radical idea to take the most successful social program in the history of the world, expand it to all of our citizens. And we have the models. Most of those countries that we consider our friends, our allies, have models that are based on, at least somewhat on what we're talking about with Medicare for All. It's not exact to all these other places, but here's the thing. I'll let the reporters look at it. And I mean this seriously. I'll let individuals decide what are the 5 most important things that you're going to use to judge whether a country is doing well in this way. I'll let you pick those, because everyone should be able to pick. You know, I might say, and I would say, let's look at life expectancy. Let's look at infant mortality rate. Let's look at whatever other issues. But you might have 5 different ones. The only place that the United States is #1 when it comes to healthcare is cost. Every other industrialized country, every other free country, every other Western country that has a Medicare for All type system is doing better on all of the things that matter when you're trying to decide whether your country is doing well enough. I think that's unacceptable. I think the United States should be leading whenever we can lead, and we certainly should be doing better for our own citizens.
What about mental health and substance abuse? How does that fit in? Does you include that
Yes.
into Medicare?
Excuse me. Yeah, absolutely. I think we have to take the stigma out of it. I think a Medicare for All system that includes mental health as part of it actually goes a long way towards ending the stigma that we have in this country in terms of providing for our fellow citizens that are fighting mental illness. And what I mean by that is, after the first generation of folks that have a Medicare for All plan, in which that's included, it will be on par even within the way we view it. It should be on par the way that we treat it anyway. But within a generation, it'll be on par the way that we view it as people, because, you know, if I wreck my knee going to work and I'm off for a little while and I'm getting care for my knee, no one, you know, that happens. It should be the same if there's a mental illness or a mental reason why you're not able to fulfill your job duties or whatever. I think a Medicare for All plan that covers that actually would go a long way towards fighting that stigma, which again I think makes our society better.
The obvious questions on Medicare for All, and there's various ways to address this, is how do you pay for it, and you know, how do you decide what services are medically necessary? You know, how do you manage it? Basically, you know, concerns about the government sort of rationing or managing healthcare was one of the reasons why we ended up with the Affordable Care Act the way it is.
The payment part of it would be, there's a 30,000-foot answer to that. I'll give that to you real briefly, and then I'll get to the meat and potatoes that you're talking about. It is amazing to me that so often in this country we will go to war, or we will send our treasure, we will send our troops to other countries, and we don't even give it that same question, that same type of bait. What's this going to cost us? gee, this Iraq war that we're getting into, what's this going to cost us over the next 12? The answer is always, we'll figure that out somewhere down the line. This is so important to send these troops there that we'll figure out the price somewhere down the line. So I think we need a reviewing of that whole idea of what's important enough to figure it out somewhere down the line, and maybe reevaluate how we do that. This particular plan, the Medicare for All plan that I'm talking about, would be a 6.7% tax on payroll and a 2.2% income tax on individuals up to $250,000. Now, what that would mean, though, is, I know that's tough when you say that we're going to put a tax on folks, but the average family, and when I say average family, I'm talking family of 4 makes $50,000 a year. They would actually see somewhere between $1,900 and a little over $4,000 more in their pockets every year. So even with the 2.2 tax, they are now going to have more money in their pockets because those skyrocketing monthly premiums we've all seen over the last few years, they're not there anymore. The cost of copays are no longer there anymore. Whatever it costs you to get whatever prescription that your medical professional says you need isn't there anymore. So when you take the advantage to the average family in terms of what they actually have in their pocket over the 2.2 tax, they're actually going to have more money. And then you have a whole side positive of that. What happens when regular people have more money in their pocket? They go out and spend it. So that's going to help the economy. They're going to spend it on things that other people either have to make or serve when they do spend it. You know, they don't put it into T-bonds and all that kind of thing. The other thing that Medicare for All would do as a side benefit, it's not a side benefit, it's a parallel big benefit. I really believe a Medicare for All system would unleash the next generation of entrepreneurs in this country. What's the single biggest thing holding people back from trying to start their own company or from trying to do something different from the job that they have? The idea that, well, I'd love to do this. I think I have the talent to do it. I know I have the passion to do it. But boy, if I go ahead and do this and something happens and I don't have health care for my family, how am I going to provide that for them? It would unleash the next generation of entrepreneurs because it would take that biggest detriment away from people who want to do it. And I'm talking about everything from you want to start a tech company all the way to you want to open that coffee shop on the town square in small town Iowa. It takes that detriment away. And I'll tell you another thing, and I don't want to sound like some type of cheerleader here, but I'll tell you what, whenever that entrepreneurial spirit has been unleashed in this country, it has been good for this country and it has been good for this world. It has been good for the rest of the world. So that is a parallel side benefit of Medicare for All that doesn't get talked about a lot, but I think it would be unleashed and it would be an amazing time for this country if that happened. We
did hear a lot of fear, though, during the discussion of the Affordable Care Act about government managing your health care and potentially rationing it and perhaps making end-of-life decisions for you, those kinds of things. So how do you allay those fears?
I didn't mean to talk over you. Isn't private insurance doing that right now? Isn't that what the for-profit system is doing right now? And they might not call it that. You know, I'll tell you what. I gave a eulogy at a dear friend's wake last year, who was told by his medical professionals that he needed a kidney transplant, and his medical professional said, "This is what we need to do. We need to get you on this list." And his provider said, "We don't cover that with what you have. We'll give you dialysis. We'll give you dialysis for as long as it takes to get dialysis." Well, if that's not the definition of not only rationing health care, but actually having a list of who's going to survive and who isn't, I don't know what is. I'd much rather have, I'll tell you what, I'd much rather have my government responsible for those type of questions working towards that end than someone who has to look at the bottom line of a profit of whether or not something's going to be given to you when your medical professional, of all things, tells you need it. So I would push back a little bit on that. I'd push back really hard on that, actually, and say it's already happening. That's what the for-profit system does. And it would actually happen less with a system that isn't for-profit in that way, because you wouldn't be looking at a bottom-line profit motive, because you have to if it's a business.
You're saying that they would not actually pay for the guy's kidney transplant, so they just let it die?
It wasn't covered. What was covered was his dialysis. That's all that was covered. Now, obviously, he could have went out and got his transplant if he could have afforded it, you know that, but he couldn't.
Okay.
Where do you get your health insurance?
Where do I get my health insurance?
Yeah.
I get it, I think, from the same place as about 80% of other people in Iowa do. I pay Walmart a amazing amount of my monthly income every month to get it.
Yeah. I mean, do you know how much you're paying for?
I pay $871 a month.
Yeah.
That's what I pay. I know what I pay because it comes out of my bank account every month.
And
don't get me started.
Are you self-employed? So you're paying?
Yeah, I have my own business. Yeah, so I pay it through my business. Yeah, but
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. You mentioned Bernie Sanders, and he endorsed your campaign, and he has come here to campaign for you.
Yes.
Medicare for All is an issue that you two have in common. Yeah. What else on your agenda is similar to Bernie Sanders, and where do you part ways?
I think the biggest place, and again, if I can answer it from a 30,000-foot view, I think the biggest place where there's a symmetry between Bernie Sanders and I, and why that campaign wound up being so joyful, as I said, and purposeful, is it's a view of government. We have a view of government that's similar. Now, we may not agree 100% on each individual program, but our view of government is that we should be demanding just the government we need, but we should be demanding all the government we need. And we should be, and we've done very well in this country when that's happened. You know, when I first was thinking about running, and I think this gets to your question really well in terms of the symmetry with Bernie Sanders, is when I was first deciding to run, there was actually an interview someone was doing on the Chris Matthews show. And he said something to the effect of, yeah, I think this kind of candidate this new politics might be really effective in a primary, but it might be a little different in a general election. And that really hit me, because this isn't new politics. A lot of the stuff we're talking about is the stuff that Franklin Roosevelt just didn't get around to doing because he happened to die. This isn't new politics. These are old ideas that are tried and true and lifted this country to unbelievable levels of prosperity that weren't even thought of before these ideas were thought. Between 1932 and 1964, when we had not only a higher tax rate for those making the most money, but were dedicated to this idea that we were going to do what we could for all of our citizens, we had the greatest period of economic growth in the history of the world. So I don't think this is a new politics. I think this is actually hearkening back to what the soul of the Democratic Party was since Franklin Roosevelt reinvented it, and to not only a winning politics, but it's a winning politics because it was winning government. It was working for people. I think that's what this is. I don't know if you have anything in mind specifically. I've never thought about it that way. I'm sure there are things that senators.
People know Bernie Sanders better than they know you.
They sure do.
That's one way to help them understand
where you
are.
I just think we have a similar view of the good that government can do when it's done properly. You know, the one thing I will say, and I think it fits into my worldview on how, and I'll leave it with this, with talking about Bernie Sanders, is rightfully so. I'm not saying the press did anything wrong with it, or that there was pushback, but people love to talk about this term that people put on him, or that he said, democratic socialist, and they love to talk about the socialist thing. What does that mean? You know what the most amazing thing about Bernie Sanders was, and it hit me here in Iowa one time during an event, watching him talk to young people, is he is, and I've worked for so many great people, so this is great among other greats, is I have never been around somebody who believes in the democratic part of it as much as Bernie Sanders. That it's the democratic institutions that can make this a better place. And that's really where I get the absolute, where I talked about the joy of it, that's where I saw the joy of it, is this man actually brought back that idea for so many people. I don't think he brought it back, it was in people, that it's the democracy part of that label that really matters. And so I think that's where we find our symmetry and where we had a great working relationship.
But you don't consider yourself as a democratic socialist or a socialist, right?
I'm a Democrat, but I think there are many things that I say that if someone said that sounds like a democratic socialist, I wouldn't push back on it. And I certainly believe in democracy. I know this is a republic, but when we use democracy, I'm using it in that term of freedom to make your own choices and do that kind of thing. But if someone called me a democratic socialist, I wouldn't take it as an insult, I'll tell you that much.
You mentioned Carol Hunter, executive editor of the Register.
Hi,
she
Karen.
came in a little bit late, but he mentioned the primary and taking a progressive agenda from the primary to the general. Do you want to ask the question that you mentioned earlier?
Yes. It just seems like this district has been drifting right in recent years, you could argue, based on election results. I do think most people would look at what you have stated as your beliefs and label it as progressive.
I would do that, yes.
How would you reach across to independents, to centrists, maybe even conservatives, and say, but I should be your congressman?
That's a great question, and I think everyone should be able to answer that in that way. First of all, your point is correct, but about if you were looking at election results, that it seems like it's been moving to the right. I think that's because the Democratic way of talking about issues hasn't been addressing the progressive side as hard as it should. I think independents are actually skewing to the left, not only in this district, but in this country. A lot of times people look at a race where, and we're seeing this more and more, not just in this district, but throughout the country, where there's more independents than there are Democrats or Republicans. And people assume independent means you're moderate. You're right in the middle. That's why you're not either of these two parties, because independents in this district are skewing to the left. They've basically said a pock on both of your houses over the way that you've treated issues and how you've addressed people over the course of the last 20 years. So getting to the real point of what you were saying, I think a bold progressive agenda actually appeals to the independents. So now you put a situation where you keep the Democratic base, which is about a third. You're actually appealing to independents who don't always vote Democratic because we haven't been strong enough on the progressive side of things. And now you're putting together a winning coalition that can win in this district and win beyond it. Look, Barack Obama won this district twice. He won the district as it's entailed once, and then if you look at the counties that are in a district, he actually won it twice, including once by 10 points. So this isn't, people didn't wake up one day and say that they were viewing something totally different than how they've been viewing in the past. What they did was they said, who's addressing more of the things that I want to address? The other thing I would say, having been there, proud of, I looked at those numbers every day. Donald Trump won this district by 4 points. If you look at the places where he kind of ran the score up, those are all counties Bernie Sanders did very, very well in on caucus night. Because the other places that I worked, and this is where I'm getting it's anecdotal, it's not scientific, but I have a background in it. Iowa, I went to Oklahoma, ran Oklahoma. That's a place Bernie Sanders couldn't win. We won it by 5 points. Went to Nebraska. That's a pretty conservative place, right? Bernie Sanders won it by double digits. Went to Indiana. Couldn't win Indiana. We won Indiana by 5 points. The thing that all those places had in common, independents could take part in the system. We were appealing to independents because independents are looking many times for a more progressive but also authentic and straightforward way of discussing our issues. So it's a great question. I just think that sometimes if we don't really get into the weeds on it, we have an assumption of what independence means. You know, when people say they're an independent, that isn't maybe necessarily the case of how they view the world right now. And I'm going to go out there and work hard to prove that I'm right on that one.
So your definition of bold progressive agenda, what parts do you specifically think right now is appealing to that independent voter?
Well, I think Medicare for all. And I actually think Medicare for all goes into your other great point about how do you appeal to some Republicans too, is if you look at the polls numbers, not only has this idea been gaining more and more support, it's actually gaining more and more support among self-identified Republicans. 2, 3, 4, even just a few years ago, it would be, you might have less than 10% of Republicans would say this is something we should consider. I've seen some polls where it's as high as 28, 30% of Republicans say this is something that we should consider. When you talk about folks who might not have a political party that you put next to them, doctors 10, 15 years ago, when you polled doctors, this was nowhere to be found. It wasn't even the numbers were so low. Almost over 50% of general practitioners now say, we've got to move towards a Medicare for all system because I can do my job better under a system like that. So I think that's an idea, definitely, that on a specific that gets us to where we can talk to independents and some Republicans. But I think it's also, when you talk about independents skewing to the left, it's that broader view of what government can accomplish if we do government correctly. And I think that has a lot to do with why I saw not only Bernie Sanders, but other progressives doing so well with independents around this country over the course of the last 2 years.
What do you think sets you apart from your Democratic opponents? Is it mostly issues or is it mostly background? And are there specific issues where you differ?
Well, I think it's a combination of both. And I want to be clear about this one because I find this one a little awkward. I think it's a good question. I don't mean it that way, Cathy.
People still have to choose.
Yeah, I find it awkward in the sense that when I'm saying these things, I'm not saying that I wouldn't prefer either one of those people that are running in this race over David Young. They're both preferable. But in my case, I think what sets me apart is there's a political answer to that because that's part of a primary. Everyone's going to make up their decision on what piece of it matters more. But part of a primary is you're trying to pick someone who can win. Mm-hmm. And so I think the bold progressive agenda gets us there in terms of what we have to stand for. So right now I'm the only one in this race that will say clearly profit needs to be taken out of the healthcare insurance piece of it. Profit should not be part of it. I have not heard that from my opponents. I'm clearly the only candidate in this race that's saying the answer to starting to pull the gap back between the huge gap we have now between rich and poor is a $15 federal minimum wage law.
You support that across the board,
yeah,
nationwide?
Yes, there is not.
15
yes,
bucks
and that's and the reason is, and there is not a state in this union that if you're making less than $15 an hour, you can afford a 2-bedroom apartment in a place where the jobs are, in a place where, well, who gets 2-bedroom apartments? Young people that are just trying to get going. Maybe they want to stay in that community that they grew up in, but they're not ready to buy a house yet. Single parents that are trying to raise their kids. So to me, $15 an hour, I get it. I've been around this long enough. I know it's an economic issue. It's a social justice issue. If you can't work 40 hours a week and live in dignity, at the very least, you should be able to live in dignity, but you definitely shouldn't have to live in poverty. And $15 an hour is where that discussion starts, because everyone under it, if on the progressive side, we're not talking $15 an hour, we're not going to leave, we shouldn't be leaving anybody out of our debate. And if I start any lower than that, I'm leaving somebody out somewhere who should be able to afford that 2-bedroom apartment. So yes, $15 an hour. On the other thing, we talked about it earlier. When I worked for Leonard Boswell was, this is the political side of it, first Democrat freshman in a decade elected in Iowa. When I worked for Tom Vilsack, first Democratic governor in a generation to get to Terrace Hill. When I worked for Chet Culver, first Democratic governor in 70 years to follow another Democratic governor through election. And then, of course, Bernie Sanders, when we started that race, we were down 61-5. And I mentioned those other states that I worked in where we were told we couldn't even compete, let alone win, that we won. I know how to win tough races. I've done it before. I've picked up something in each of those races. So the political side of it is I have spent my adult life working on the type of races that this will be. Because let me be clear about this. I have a lot of respect for David Young as a politician. He is not a pushover. He's going to be tough to beat. But I think if you look at my track record on the campaigns that I've been around and the issues that I have fought for, oftentimes campaigns and issues that people said this is not going to happen, and to be victorious as many times through that, I would put that out to folks that look at that as part of their equation. I know how to win, and I will fight every day with taking all of that knowledge that I've picked up through the years. It wasn't intuitive. It was, you pick those things up on campaigns, and I'll be ready from day one to wage the type of campaign that's needed, because we have to win this election in November.
You mentioned respect for David Young as a politician.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that he's done in office that you think was a good idea, or that you agree with?
You know what he does that I am, and I would try to be the same way. What he does that I think is important, and maybe we need a little more in our politics. If you go to a David Young town hall meeting, he treats you with respect, even though I would argue his votes actually will hurt you when he goes back to D.C. But he treats his constituents with respect, even when there's a disagreement at a town hall meeting. And this is a unique business, politics and government. You know, we expect that just about everywhere else. You know, if your butcher treats you nice, you don't use it as like a way to say, man, I got a great butcher. He actually treats me well. It's a little different in politics and government. I mean, we've got a guy right to the, you know, right to a little to the north of us that, you know, it's basically the Carney Barker of the American right in Steve King. And so it becomes even more apparent and sometimes David Young is allowed to fly under the radar in terms of his votes. But I would say that he treats people with respect. And that's something that he should get credit for. I do give him credit for. I haven't seen many votes that he's made that I agree with, though. He's Donald Trump's biggest enabler in the United States Congress. He's actually voted with Donald Trump 98% of the time.
What do you think is David Young's biggest mistake or biggest failing?
I think his biggest failing. I don't think you can call it a success to. If you're agreeing with Donald Trump 98% of the time, that's obviously my worldview. It would be nice to be able to think that there could be some pushback on some of the things.
Vote, though,
the most recent it depends on what month we're talking in this case, but really the most recent is the tax bill. Here's a bill. You talk about talking about how these things matter and how we're going to do things. This is a tax bill that they didn't even read. They passed it. They gave the biggest cuts again to the richest people in this country, flipped totally what we should be doing with our taxation policy. And then they did give something to working people, but the proof in the pudding on why I think this is such a terrible tax bill is if you make a lot of money, that tax cut is there forever. And if you're just getting a little back because of this tax break, that's sunset. There's a sunset on that one in 2026. If anything, these things should be flipped. If we're going to give tax breaks to working people, let's at least make those the ones that we're not sunsetting, and then they have to worry about it later down the line. So the most recent incarnation would be that one. That tax bill was just absolutely a devastating hit for working Americans. And it's interesting. I think everything I've seen, both anecdotally and in polls, working Americans got that. They understood it. They knew that. Don't get me wrong. I understand that if you get $225 back and you're working for a living, you need that, and you're going to do something with it. But they also understood that it did not affect what really needed to be affected. And I think for the first time, really with these type of actions that we usually see from Republicans when they're in control, working people realize that, and there's being a big pushback against it.
Are there particular tax cuts that you would consider a priority, or are there other things that are more important at this point?
Particular tax cuts?
Tax cut for lower income people, those kinds of things.
Yeah, look, again, I'm going to go back to something I said earlier, is that, and it's a good way to encapsulate it. Look, I believe in all the government we need, but only the government we need. So I think there are definitely places that we can look to rein in government, but I don't know if that necessarily means we should be cutting taxes on certainly folks at the top end. If anything, what we should be doing is figuring out how to, we know how to do it if we had the will, to raise the taxes of those at the higher end that have gained so much because of this country, and should be paying a little more. And then from there, that's how we can figure out how we can either keep the same or cut the taxes of working people to the point where we don't lose the revenue we need to do the things we want to do too. See, that's really the problem with how they do it, is they don't change the amount that we're spending ever on what we're doing. They just give everyone a tax cut, and then when they cut the taxes of those that we're bringing the most into the system to pay for these things, but we don't cut any of those things too, they don't have the will to do that, then we wind up with the problem that we have, whether it's a deficit or however you want to look at it.
Who do you think are the income levels that aren't paying enough in taxes? I mean, are we talking about 250,000 a year? Are we talking about less than that?
I think 250,000 would be a good place to start, but I think really when you move it up to what's happening now is we're seeing millionaires and billionaires that are paying a lower percentage of their income than working people. And I'm talking about people that are working 2-3 jobs just to stay at the same level that they were at 15, 20 years ago. So I think we have to start. We usually start the other way, and it's an inverted way of looking at it. I think we have to start at the top 1% and figure out what needs to be done with them. And I definitely think that they should be taxed at a higher level to pay for these things that we're talking about. Look, this country, you talk about people like to talk about patriotism. That to me, that's the height of lack of patriotism is to not be willing to pay your fair share for a country that put you in an incredible situation where you're living in wealth that most people can't even imagine.
We're in the middle of a big national conversation about gun control. Where do you think you stand? Well, where do you stand on what should be done?
Yeah.
You know, is there a way to change this conversation between just NRA on one side and high school kids on the other?
Yeah, well, no, there is a way to change it, and actually your question, and there's specifics that I want to get into on it, actually lead into the bigger issue that gets to the second part of your question. 90% of Americans in recent polls say that we need to close the gun show loophole. A little over 80% of Americans say that we should get these assault-style weapons off our streets. Close to 90% of Americans say that we need a longer period of time between when someone goes in to want to purchase a gun to make sure the paperwork's right and when they get the gun. And then close to 90% of Americans think we need stronger laws to just ensure that our fellow citizens that are struggling with mental illness, it's tougher for them to get a gun. So 80%, 85, 90%. And yet we don't even have a serious discussion about it in the United States Congress. Again, I mentioned this earlier. I know we're a republic and we're not a democracy, so I get it. Doesn't mean just because a majority says something you're going to get it. But when 90% of the people on these 4 big issues, which I do support all 4 of those issues, you can't even get a serious discussion. The money is so prevalent and so important in our system that they're able to stymie it to the point where it's not discussed. This leads into the second part of your question. We need fundamental campaign finance reform in this country. When the NRA can buy, and really that's what they do, when they can buy a congressman like David Young, here we are in the middle of America, basically right smack in the middle of America, and he's getting the 3rd most funds of any congressman there throughout the country from the NRA. When the folks with their hands on the lever of the money have so much more power than 90% of the people that they can stop a serious discussion, let alone a vote, that to me is the greatest example of why we need campaign finance reform. And there's other examples of it, but that is the greatest example of it. So I think we need to fundamentally change the way we fund elections in this country. As a congressman, I would support any bill that overturned the Citizens United case. I would also support any type of bill that would move us towards a public funding of elections. So that is the specific. We need to address those problems. I just don't see how we're going to address them when the money can mean you don't even talk about it.
Is it only the money, though, or is it the ability to, for example, get a primary opponent, and encourage a primary opponent, that sort of the large membership of NRA and kind of the grassroots backing of them as opposed to just the greenbacks?
It's the money.
It's the money.
It's the money.
Okay.
The money is what allows them to do that. The money is what allows them to scare you into the idea that, oh my Lord, because believe me, when you're sitting around these tables, because I've been on both sides now of it, as an advisor, as an operative, when they look at it and say, oh my Lord, if they throw $1.2 million into my primary, that's sure going to be tough, because the things you talked about cost money. So it is the money, absolutely.
Immigration. Right now, it seems like immigration policy is being decided by Donald Trump and the courts. You know, Donald Trump signs an order, the courts say no,
Right.
And we go back to square one. So, what would be your idea of, you know, an effective immigration policy, and how do you again get past the sort of polarization that's preventing anything from happening?
Well, we have to talk about it and do it in a way. First of all, my view is that in terms of the dreamers, in terms of these Americans, because that's what they are, these Americans that have been here, they know no other country. They're invested in this country, but they've also invested back in this country, if that's the right way to put it. So many of them have like I said, no other country. They've gone to school here. We're now, because it's been happening for so long, they've started businesses, they've raised families, they've served in our military. I don't know how else to define people that are the best of us in any other way. If you talk about that, these are some of the best of us. So I think we need to have the shortest period of time for people that fit that definition between when we say they're on the clock for a path to citizenship. We need to make that path as short as we can make it, because I think they've earned it.
Beyond the people who are here already, would you allow a significant increase in legal immigration? I mean, would you take some of those long barriers, roadblocks out so that more people could come in legally, or get here on visas and be able to
I think you have to look at each. That's one of those things where I think, because it is fluid, is that a 30,000-foot answer on that one probably isn't the best answer, because it's going to change from year to year. But I would say this. This country has always been at our best and has always moved forward when we have been more welcoming. So if the question was put that way in a general, all things are equal, I would say yes. We need to bring in, we need to make it as easy as we can with all of the other things that we have to think about, including the safety of our country, to allow people to come here who want to take what used to be called the American dream and become part of our society. I think we've always been better when we've done that. And not just, I'm sorry, Cathy, and not just, I think one of the things that we've, and this is a very personal thing to me because of where my grandparents came from when they came from Italy. I think we have done a good job in opening it up to scientists and doctors and those that can go to college. And we've kind of moved away from, because we split working people too often in the way we do our rhetoric, we've moved away from the idea that you can bring something to this country if what you want to do is work.
What about the concern, though, that that immigration, especially uncontrolled illegal immigration, drives down wages for everybody? You're concerned about
$15 an hour federal minimum wage would go a long way towards cutting into that. One of the reasons it's able to drive down wages is because the minimum wage is so low anyway. So that's one of the reasons it's able to drive it down. So again, I think I understand when people bring that up, because when you're trying to do the things that you need to do to make the life better for your family, it's sometimes easy to split people against each other. But the last thing we need to do is take people that are working hard every day and split them against other people who are motivated by the same thing. And so what we really need to do is strengthen the laws so that the employers can't be doing that any longer. Don't have a free rein to bring to bring people in to allow them to work illegally for lower wages than they should. Because you know what else is the truth about it? If you're working for less than $7.25 an hour, or if you're working without benefits, and if you're working without Social Security, and you're working without any chance of health care, you're actually being exploited. So we can throw terms which I don't agree with and deem people illegal, But you know what? What's actually happening to them is immoral, because they are being put in a position, again, where the work isn't leading to dignity, and that should be our goal.
A lot of the other discussion about immigration has been sort of a push me, pull you between the actual immigration policy and border security. So where do you come down on border security? What do you think is really needed? And where does that fit in your priorities as far as other threats to national security?
I will tell you this, and I don't mean this as a pushback. I've been out throughout this whole district for the last 8 months, and I've heard a lot of questions about a lot of different issues. A lot of them on the very things we've talked about up till now, so good job. But I haven't heard that from anybody. I have not heard that question. I don't think it's a priority. Look, whenever we can make our country better, and just because you're not thinking about it doesn't mean you shouldn't be trying to make it better, but there are so many other things that are a much higher priority right now in terms of allowing the quality of life of Americans to get better. And so, is it important? Yes, government needs to secure its borders. Is it important? Yes, government needs to make sure people, regardless of whether they're coming here to work to try to make their lives better, and we need to make sure that people's lives have dignity. Yes, all of those things are important, but there are so many other things other than border patrol. And in a lot of these cases, when it comes to immigration, there's a lot of cases when we're looking for, I view it as they're looking for policies that don't even have a problem. They're policies in search of a problem too often. I just think things like. But
it's also a bargaining chip. When you want to talk about comprehensive immigration reform, sometimes that's what you have to.
Yeah, I understand that from a poli-sci 105 standpoint, and I get it, and that's actually a good way of putting it. But you know what? I haven't seen a lot of bargaining in the United States Congress over the course of the last 5 or 6 years. There's sure a heck of a lot of times when we hear about, oh, let's compromise more, let's compromise more. I'll be honest, and maybe I sound like a partisan on this one, I can't think of one thing the Republicans have compromised on since Barack Obama was elected president. They didn't even come to the table on the ACA, and a third of it was written by the Heritage Foundation, and they still wouldn't even come and talk about it. So I think we might be at a time in our history where maybe we, progressives, Democrats, have to stop looking more at where the bargaining chips are and maybe make the bargaining chip, there's more of us than you, and we're going to keep working our politics, and we're going to get the things done that we need to get done.
Would you make changes in NAFTA?
Would I make changes in NAFTA? One of the first things I ever did as an organizer was an anti-NAFTA rally in Chicago. There needs to be a lot of changes in NAFTA. One thing I say very clearly is I do not say that I would not unilaterally vote against any trade agreement that was put in front of the United States Congress. What I also say is I have not seen one in the last 25 years I would have voted for. So where NAFTA needs to be changed, quite simply, is we need to expand our ability to enforce other countries into standards that are good for the world, but also good for the American worker. I just don't see that in these, not only NAFTA, but in GATT and in these other trade agreements. Look, I get it, especially in a district like this. The greatest thing that can happen to an Iowa farmer, because they're so good at what they do, is to have bigger markets. And I understand the argument that NAFTA helps open up markets, but we can't be pitting working people against each other because they're in different segments of the society, different segments of what they do for a living. And I think that's what the problem with things like NAFTA, things with this recent tariff that the president put out, is that they split working people, and it picks winners and losers among people that should be shoulder to shoulder moving forward together. So I have trouble with how I would improve NAFTA, since I was so against it, and I've been so against the whole concept of it from the beginning.
So, quick foreign policy question. If the president sought to renew congressional authority for military action in Syria, and you're a member of Congress. Do you support that?
No.
Under what are there any conditions under which you would support?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you say there's any conditions, you'd have to look at it at the time that that it's being asked for. I don't see a reason to have American intervention there right now. But this actually gets us into a bigger issue that's a longer term issue, and it's great that you asked that question because we don't ask that question enough. You know, for the last more than a generation now, the United States Congress has ceded its constitutional authority to presidents, and this is not a partisan issue. They've done it for Democrats, they've done it for Republicans, and what I mean by that is they've ceded their constitutional authority that only Congress can declare war. And I think Congress, and if I was a congressman, I would be a loud, loud voice that American presidents, regardless of their political party, can only send Americans into harm's way with congressional authority and with a declaration of war. I just think the Congress has literally ceded a constitutional mandate that it has, and I think that's unconscionable.
You and Rand Paul can be arm in arm on that one.
You know what? American politics, people think it's left to right like this. It's actually a circle, and the left and the right are a little closer to each other than people think sometimes.
I want to ask you about your free college tuition plan. What does that look like? And you mentioned if people earn it. How do people? Yeah,
when I say people earn it, when I'm talking about earning it, is if you do everything you're supposed to do, you get the grades you're supposed to get. You have the minimum that the standards are for that university, for that public university. You shouldn't be denied entrance into that university because you couldn't afford it, or because you didn't want to go in debt for the rest of your life to study whatever you want to study. We can do this actually with a less than 1 penny tax on every Wall Street speculative trade that happens. And I've talked to my friends that do such things. That wouldn't stop those guys at all. There would be no down trend in those type of trades. So you're not having a problem there. You'd be able to fund this to the point that you'd need to. And you know what? I don't think it's that crazy of a thing to ask Wall Street to help middle America and working people get their kids to school and to reach their fullest potential, especially after it was pretty much middle America that bailed them out when they pretty much stole everything that wasn't nailed down in the last decade.
Is there an income limit then? So
No.
that this is for everybody?
Yep. What we're doing is, if you think about it this way. There was a point in this country when we said, you know what, K through or first through 8th grade is something that every student should have, and we're going to make sure public schools are there to educate our people. And then we said, well, you know, the economy is such that everyone should be able to go to high school all the way through, 16, 17, whatever that is, but basically we said 12 years of school, because that's what you need to have the minimum to be able to compete in our economy. Well, the economy's changed, and so really you need secondary education. And when I say secondary education, I'm not just talking 4-year schools. Make our community colleges free, make our apprenticeship programs free, trade schools, because we now have an economy that if you leave school with just a high school diploma, you are at a disadvantage to be able to compete. So we've done it in the past. This is just accepting the fact that, we're 120 years or 130 years away from when we first said this is the standard, because this is how you're going to be able to compete. And so we're just putting our citizens in a better chance to compete in the economy and in the world that they're going to be living in.
I sort of remember sitting in a room with Hillary Clinton. I don't think it was this room, maybe downstairs, when she asked the question, why should taxpayers pay to send Donald Trump's kids to school? In other words, why should wealthy people get free college? And
again, my argument back to that, I think at the time even, was why did we pay for rich, wealthy people's kids to go to public high school? First of all, I have a feeling that Donald Trump's kids probably wouldn't have been competing with me to get into Illinois State anyway. We're not talking about me competing with them to get to Harvard or wherever it is they went. So it's one of those, and I don't mean this as an attack on Secretary Clinton. That argument is kind of a red herring in the sense that we already say that's the case from kindergarten through high school. I just don't think a lot of people in Donald Trump's wealth class are going to be taking spots up. And in fact, the trade-off is that more kids that would be earning their way in there would have a chance to go to those secondary public schools, and that's well worth it.
There's kind of a pushback in this state right now against the four-year university education in a lot of ways in favor of vocational education and skilled trades where there's a lot of jobs that need to be filled at pretty good salaries. How do you sort of incorporate that? I mean, first of all, is that a wrong direction?
No, it's not a wrong direction. And actually, that's one of the things we say about this is when we talk about secondary education, I said earlier, is we're not just talking about four-year universities. We're talking about trade schools. We're talking about apprenticeship programs. We're talking about the next level of education that you would need to get to where you want to go to do the things that you want to do to be part of part of your community, part of this society. So I would include those as part of this plan because I think we do need to recognize that, and that's actually good. That's a good thing to recognize that, is that people that want to go into social sciences and they want to go to the University of Iowa to study that, or they want to go into ag business and they go to Iowa State to study that. And then you're right, some people are going to say, I want to be a plumber. And I want to be the best plumber in the neighborhood. I want to be a tradesman. And that opportunity should be there too for people. Absolutely.
We're getting to the end of our time, but I did want to ask you, when it comes to religious freedom in our country, what does that mean to you in terms of policy? How do you incorporate that philosophy into policy?
I think that in terms of religious freedom, what it means is that your religion matters absolutely not to any of the other benefits that are protected and you have as a United States citizen. So to me, that's what religious freedom. It means protecting your right to worship the way you want to. It also protects the person's right who doesn't want to worship at all. So that to me is what's encompassing about it. And I think that's actually, I know there's a struggle with that from time to time, but I think ultimately when we are making those type of decisions, which we have to do from time to time in our society, when we make those decisions with that policy in mind in the way I just described it, is actually when we're, I believe, reaching closer to what our founders thought it should be.
So, I mean, one of the trickier issues under that is the question of religious business owners and do they have to provide contraception or insurance for their employees? Where do you come down on questions like that?
I don't believe you have the right to to discriminate against someone else under the guise of that's my religion. So when those two things cross, I would argue on the side of you don't have a right to discriminate and use a religion or or lack of a religion as your argument for saying that that's what's allowing you to discriminate.
Are you fine with taxpayer funding for Planned Parenthood?
Absolutely.
Would you eliminate the restriction people think is kind of specious anyway to say it can't be used for abortion services?
I don't even think Planned Parenthood has ever argued that they want that restriction, and maybe they haven't. I just haven't seen it. So that's one of those issues where we're getting into another point about it. But yes, I would be. Look, Planned Parenthood has actually. If your thought is I want less abortions, I want less abortions in our society, Planned Parenthood has actually been a group that has brought that number down because of the things they do with the services that they do provide. So first of all, you're right, they don't get federal money to provide for abortions. The things that they do get federal money for have actually lowered the amount of abortions that take place in this country. So even if your view is, I want less abortions and that's my only bottom line, you should be for Planned Parenthood being fully funded, because they've done their part in that way.
What have we forgotten to ask you about?
I don't know. It seems like you've asked me quite a bit.
We had a long. We have more questions than time, but I want you to get. If there's something that's really on your mind that you want to say, go ahead and say it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, just maybe just kind of wrap up and maybe explain why we should endorse you.
Well, I think it's the two-pronged part of it, and part of the issue is who's going to be the strongest Democrat to have the type of debate that we need in this district and in this country going forward. With someone like David Young. I believe that my past experience shows that I'll be able to do that. I believe we have to discuss these things. And I believe that this country is going to be better. We're moving towards Medicare for all. We're moving towards a discussion on the idea that we have to get big money out of our politics. I want to be part of that debate. I want to be the part of that debate and the debate on the other things. Not only because I've been a part of it for 30 years as an organizer, but because I believe that I have the passion and I have the background that can make those debates successful. But we have to win before then, and we mentioned that before. We have to win before then. And I believe that because of my experience working on tough campaigns, working in tough organizational situations, working around the government when they were making big decisions, puts me in the best position to bring that fight, that argument to David Young in a way that would benefit Democrats. And I think when Democrats win, when progressives win, we benefit this country. So, look, this has been we talk about welcoming. I got here 20 years ago and I stayed in Iowa because I just love the type of politics that's practiced here. It's a pure politics. It's a politics where you can discuss issues and that you're trying to make things better for people. I've been around a lot of people that have done that. I'm at that point where I want to pay back a little bit, pay back to this great place that's allowed me to do what I've always wanted to do. You know, these guys sitting over here on the side have heard me say this before. I'm the luckiest guy in the world. I'm doing what I wanted to do since I was in 4th grade. I drive to work every day. I look up at the sky and I thank Grandpa for making the boat. And this place has allowed me to do that. I want to give back a little bit. I think I can do that as the Democratic nominee. I really believe I could do that as a United States Congressman. That's how I would end it.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for your
Thank you.
time. 2 other Democrats are running in this contested primary for Iowa's 3rd district. They are also scheduled to meet with Register editors and reporters in the next few weeks. You can watch our meetings live and see DesMoinesRegister.com for the schedule and for all the coverage of the primary race and into the general election. Thanks.